Welcome everybody to this evening's event. This is a joint event with Latrobe City Libraries, Wellington, East Gippsland and West Gippsland Regional Library Service. And we're delighted to welcome Cassandra Pybus tonight, who's going to be in conversation with Claire Halliday. So I've just said if you could just keep your microphones on mute and your screens off, just to avoid the distractions. Claire is going to talk with Cassandra for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be about 15 minutes at the end where you can ask some questions. You can write your questions in the chat box during the discussion, and then we will do our best to go back through them and ask them towards the end there. And we are going to be recording this session, and you will get access to a copy of that recording later on. And if you're not a member of your local library, please join up, because it's your support that allows us to put these events on. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Cassandra Pybus is an award-winning author and a distinguished historian. She is the author of 12 books and has held research professorships at the University of Sydney, Georgetown University in Washington, DC, the University of Texas and King's College London. Claire Halliday has been a freelance writer for 25 years. As an author, she's had 5 of her own non-fiction books published, including Things My Mother Taught Me and Things My Father Taught Me, featuring interviews with Australian identities exploring the impact of nature versus nurture. She's currently working on a new book and an accompanying podcast, a fascinating tale of a family whose father was accused of being involved in Australia's most iconic murder mystery, the 1966 disappearance of the Beaumont children. Over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank the collaborative effort of the libraries who are bringing this event to you. And thanks to everybody in the audience for taking the time out of their evening to join us. And of course, welcome to Cassandra Pybus, our featured author. Welcome, Cassandra.
Lovely to be here. And from the land of the Palawa people in southern Tasmania. Yeah.
Now we're here to talk about your most recent book, which has been an award-winning book. It's won the National Biography Award for 2021, which is a fantastic achievement. And we're talking about the real-life story of the person whose name is the title of the book, Truganini. So there's a lot to explore. I'd just love to start by asking you, though, about your personal connection to this story. And I'm not meaning, I guess, in a broad sense of you just as an Australian, but you who actually had ancestors who told the story of an old Aboriginal woman who would wander across their farm on Bruny Island in southeast Tasmania in the 1850s and the 1860s. Now, as a child, you didn't know this woman was Truganini and that she was walking over the country of her clan. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about your discovery of her story and the links to your own family connection to that story.
Yes, well, as a child, I didn't hear that story. I actually found that story in research where my ancestors had been interviewed by a person who was looking into Aboriginal use of stone tools at the turn of the 20th century. But I knew about Truganini because I went to school in Tasmania, and we all knew about Truganini. She was the last Tasmanian, we were told, and we might have been shown a picture of this old woman in her black dress and you know, tragic story, end of story. I lived in next to Oyster Cove, and my great aunts had a house right on the edge of Oyster Cove. And my cousins and I would go with our parents every now and again to visit the great aunts, and we would escape from the cloying atmosphere of their house and walk around the edge of the water to a sort of disused area where there were kind of remains of huts, and you could root around in there and find old clay pipes and things. And it was like a lifetime later, when I returned as an adult in my late 30s to Tasmania, that I discovered to my amazement that was the site of the Aboriginal station at Oyster Cove, and that was actually where Truganini had been living for the bulk of her life, and that she was the neighbour of my family, that she had lived more or less next door to my family. And I knew nothing of this. And then as I got into the story further, I discovered that on Bruny Island, which was her traditional territory, my family had been given the largest single land grant, a massive amount of land. It was, 4,000 hectares. Freehold title, here it's yours, even when she was still living there. So of course they remembered her walking across their land, but of course it wasn't their land, it was her land. But they would never have seen it that way settlers never did see it that way. And so when you get confronted with a story like that, it's a bit, confronting. And then a friend of mine, Linda Ryan, who was doing research wrote the first book about the Aboriginal Tasmanians, said to me, in George Augustus Robinson's journals, he talks about your ancestor, And I went, who's George Augustus Robinson? She said, oh, you must read. And then I discovered the journals of George Augustus Robinson, who'd lived next door to my ancestor on Bruny Island and had written these detailed diaries over a period of 5 or 6 years, during which time he travelled with Truganini and a handful of other Aboriginal people. And he paid a lot of attention to them. And it just turned my life around, that book. Suddenly, these people who were meant to be gone, dead, lost. Oh, it's so sad, but isn't it lucky that they're not here anymore and putting, asking for their land back or wanting some reparations from us? And so I had it always. My first book was about that, Community of Thieves, and I've always had it. It's always been there in my heart, that I need to engage with this woman whose life was extinguished to make way for mine, basically. And so eventually, when it became apparent to me that nobody in the Indigenous community was going to engage with this story, it was too fraught for them because she'd been positioned as the last and they were still here, that I kind of plunged into it. And I've been amazed at how astonishingly people right around Australia have responded to this story. And of course they say, but we didn't know. And at first I was a bit cynical about that, but actually I didn't know either when I came back to Tasmania. And it was only because I was a historian and had historian friends that I even bothered to dig into it. And so what I'm trying to do here is give back the real person and not the mythologized last Tasmanian.
I want to talk about that in more detail in a moment, that sort of myth making around that. But you just said something before that struck me as really powerful. This you described her as this woman whose life had been extinguished to make way for yours. Just tell me more about that, like your response to that as a historian, as a woman, as an Australian. What was the sort of emotions going through you with that discovery and the more you looked into it as a historian?
Well, it's true of all of us. We all live on stolen land. We all stand on the shoulders of the dispossessed and the murdered and the lost. And so I think that increasingly, that starts to become, for me, and I think for a lot of Australians, the response to this book, for example, would indicate that to me, have begun to think that this is a kind of reckoning that we have to have with ourselves. I mean, it's a reckoning, for example, that the Germans haven't had that much trouble making about terrible things that happened in their past, and the South Africans and even North Americans in relation to their treatment of their native people. But we have kind of spun this other story, and especially in Tasmania, where the story has been, they just disappeared because they were so primitive they couldn't possibly adapt. And it just seemed to me that to be a proud descendants of settlers, I had to acknowledge that and a proud Tasmanian, I think I live in paradise. I do live in paradise. To acknowledge that I live the charmed life that I live because Truganini and her people were removed, extinguished, got rid of. There was no other way to talk about it. I mean, it was a genocidal process. And and what does that, trying to grapple with what that means. There's no point in just feeling guilty about it or even shamed about it. It's more a point of how do I make the stories that we tell about ourselves more true, more real, that a lot has been lost to give us what we've got. And in my case, I saw it embodied in this woman, because I could see this woman in George Augustus Robinson's journals. We did have photographs and paintings of her, and I could have a sense that this woman was the person I had to acknowledge as the person who made my life, my beautiful, charmed life possible by her own exile and despair and eventual and dispossession. Yeah.
Now, I'd love to talk about the photographs, because that's something that struck me, is that there are, more than one photographs of her. And I was just wondering how you feel and how much that helped you bring her story to life, seeing the image of her, being able to sort of visualize who she was and have a better sense of her as a woman.
I am very ambivalent about the photographs. The photographs are mostly taken for scientific purposes. By people who are just measuring up with their eyes so they could get their hands on her skeleton and hands on her skull. The paintings, on the other hand, were done at the behest of George Augustus Robinson for the book he was going to write about the about to become extinct people of Tasmania. But at the same time, they were painted by an artist who was dealing with not a dispossessed, despairing people, but who was dealing with people who were still, for most of the time, out in the Tasmanian wilderness living their traditional life. They were still, for the purposes of those portraits, they were still dressed in their traditional. Truganini, of course, has a shell necklace. The men have got their hair ochred and done in ringlets. And so you're looking at the people as they were, and they're glorious, those portraits. And so I haven't used most of the other photographs because I find them distasteful and I don't like the purpose for which they were taken. But I have included one which really kind of sums it up for me, which is a portrait of her as an old woman sitting in a chair wearing, she's obviously been dressed up for the occasion, but she has her shell necklaces on, and standing over her with his arms folded and looking down on her is one of those men, John Woodcock Graves, who would then, once she was dead, go on and make his kind of name for himself as the person who claimed to have been Truganini's friend, who claimed to have special knowledge of her. I mean, he was also active in robbing her grave, active in making sure her skeleton was after she'd begged people not to mutilate her body, not to take her skeleton. This man, who then went on to claim this special relationship with her, was one of the men who made sure that the Royal Society of Tasmania got hold of her body. And the reason that he'd been seeing her in the days before her death was to get as much information out of her as he possibly could in terms of, words of her language, getting her to sing songs for him and stuff like that. I mean, there's nothing caring or humane about this. And then he goes on to present himself as the great friend of the Aborigines. And he's not alone in this. I mean, this is the nature of the relationship. It's completely, once you have dispossessed them, ruined their lives, left them with nothing, as one person said of her, these left with nothing but mere existence, been robbed of everything but mere existence. They then started to commodify her, like we can sell photographs of her, we can put her skeleton on display, we can sell stories about her to the newspapers and to, publishers.
And I guess
that's angry about this, you can see it.
No, and fair enough. You talked about what you'd been taught of the history around her when you were a child in Tasmania at primary school. And I've heard you say that there is a whole lot of myth making around her story. You know, she's become this icon for this monumental tragedy. And I was just wondering, you've touched on some of them, you know, in what you've said so far, but what are the key elements of that myth that you really wanted to correct and dismiss? And why
well,
was it
she was the last?
Yeah.
First, that a whole race of people were extinguished and she was the last. It is true that the tribal people of Tasmania, the people who were first encountered by Captain Cook and then by Captain Bligh and then by the settlers, were extinguished. The word that they used to use, the settlers, was extirpated, which is a kind of Old English word that means to eradicate. It was usually applied to vermin or foxes or rats. And so it was terribly important to keep insisting that she was the last, because then you couldn't possibly have a situation where you could have to continue to, as the rest of Australia has had to do, continue to engage with the problem of the Aboriginal problem, the problem of the native people, the problem of, dare we say it, the original owners of the land, the dispossessed owners of the land. So, of course, they couldn't wait for Truganini to die. So they didn't know anything about her until they worked out that she was the last of them. And then suddenly there was all this attention being paid to her in the last year of her life. And then as soon as she was dead, she was famous. Right? Suddenly it was Queen Truganini and all these stories about her, which were very interestingly violent and voyeuristic. They were usually about her being raped by sealers and her mother being killed in front of her eyes and her fiancé having his hands chopped off
and thrown in the ocean. And
so he drowned in the ocean. And you think, why is it? This is the kind of story that they want to tell about her. I mean, she was a very lively, intelligent, adaptive woman. She lived longer than most white women would live in the 19th century. She had a fantastic life. She never became somebody's servant or somebody's slave, as would normally be the case with Indigenous people in the 19th century. She basically made white people her servants. She was astonishing like that. But that's not the story that people wanted to tell. They wanted to say, they're all gone, and we can prove it because she's the last. And also, then they could say, oh, and it's so tragic. It's so tragic, you know, that they just faded away and died. And she's the last, and she's the last. This lasting narrative is really important. And so that's one of the reasons why the descendants of the Aboriginal people in Tasmania get very upset if you talk about Truganini as the last. And so when my book came out in its pre-publication release for booksellers and things, the people in the marketing department had put on the cover the woman who was known to be the last Tasmanian. Oh my God, you can't do that, you can't say that, because it's not true. You know, Aboriginal people aren't just, I mean, it'd be like saying nobody would be Irish unless they were, you know, they were back in the day before the English ever entered Ireland, you know, back in the 13th century. Then maybe you could be Irish, but then maybe there were other people who weren't Irish, you know, who came to Ireland. I mean, you know, this idea of the purity of Indigenous people is ridiculous. And so, but it was terribly important that she be the last. So then they could say there aren't any more. And actually, somebody said that to me only the other day. They said, oh, I thought Truganini was the last Aboriginal person. Well, no, actually, you know, there's still Aboriginal people in Tasmania.
Yes, we've just got to learn this new history, I guess.
Well, I mean, we learn it every day if we look at the television. I mean, does anybody look at Stan Grant and say, well, he's not Aboriginal? Well, I hope they don't anyway.
Yeah.
Or any number of people that you see on television programs and talking and so forth, does anybody question their Aboriginality because they've got other than pure Indigenous DNA? No, of course not. But it was so important in Tasmania and indeed in 19th century Australia. It's why they started stealing children, so that you could kind of get rid of the purebloods, as they called them, and then you could say they're all gone, they're not here anymore, we don't owe them anything. I don't think they could have prefigured land claims, but it is the case that European law, at the time, as Henry Reynolds has pointed out, recognised that these people had rights in the land, and so best they were all gone, so then you wouldn't have to deal with that little problem that they actually did have legal rights to the land that you'd taken off them.
I did want to go back to her early years, but while we are talking about her later years now, before this event started, you and I were talking about this sort of the sentimentality that came up around her death. And you were mentioning all the things that were named after her. And we mentioned, of course, that Melbourne suburb, which is not... Yeah, and you said yourself you didn't know the history of why...
But I'm starting to make a collection of all of the places that are named after her. And that man who I spoke so firmly about, John Woodcock Grays, named one of his daughters after her too. Okay. And so there's lots of Truganinis this or Truganannas that, or and she was on a postage stamp at one stage too. And this is all curious when you think about it, because she had no role in settler consciousness at all until it was apparent that she was the last Tasmanian, and then they got interested in her. Yeah. But really, even then, I mean, if you do a search on the newspapers, they don't talk about her at all. And then suddenly it's everywhere.
Now, there's another man whose name you've mentioned. Now, she spent 5 years on a journey around Tasmania across rugged highlands and forests with the man you named before, George Augustus Robinson. And you describe him as a self-styled missionary who was collecting the survivors to send them into exile on Flinders Island, really. You describe him as someone who's vain, who's problematic, a man with a cramped Puritan spirit was your description. What more can you tell us about who this man was?
He's one of the most fascinating characters in early Australian history, I think. He's, when people talk to me about, when they read my book, they're a bit horrified by George Augustus Robinson. I say, he's the best you're going to get. He genuinely cared for these people. He genuinely saw them as human beings, complex human beings with complex emotions, with a rich spiritual life, with an amazing capacity to adapt to their landscape, and he respected that. And that's why reading his journal is such a thrill, because he really pays attention to them and admires them. But he's also a evangelical Christian, and he keeps having to remind himself that his real job is to bring these people to God, and also his other real job is to please the government, because he's just a lowly tradesman. And he wants to climb up the economic ladder, and this is his way to do it, which is to clear the island of Tasmania of its Indigenous people, so that the settlers have got no fear that somebody might spear one of their sheep to give them something to eat, and or even spear them after they've killed somebody else in their clan, which is the sort of thing that was going on. And so he is constantly in this battle between his best and worst instincts, between his wanting to care and protect people from people he knows to have murderous intentions towards them, and also use them as a way to better himself, and a way to climb up the economic ladder. And he does climb up the economic ladder very successfully, and basically, ultimately, he betrays the people he befriended and promised to look after. But it could be argued that he had very little choice about that matter. They were going to get rid of those people come hell or high water. And he was trying very, very hard to get the best possible deal for them, which was not a very good deal at all. But certainly he did try to take them away from Flinders Island to Victoria, in the hope that they could get back into their traditional way of life in what was then known as New Holland, and was basically, virgin country. And that turned out very badly too.
Well, can we talk about that in a bit more detail? Because we are obviously based in Victoria. You're obviously in Tasmania, and we've got a very strongly Victorian audience. So what more can you tell us for people that haven't read your book yet or don't know the history of this to the level that they should really know it, about the Victorian connection?
Before Victoria was Victoria, it was this little settlement known as the Port Phillip district, and it soon spawned a town, which became Melbourne. And George Augustus Robinson went there, an appointment which was directed by the Colonial Office through the Governor of New South Wales, Governor Gibbs, to become the protector of the Aborigines, because they didn't want to see, the Colonial Office in England did not want to see happening in Victoria what happened in Tasmania. But of course, by the by, it was turned out to be much worse in Victoria even. But he had not been allowed to take the, 60, 70 or so Aboriginal people still living on Flinders Island with him. He was only allowed to take one family to be his personal servants, apparently. And these would have been Truganini, her husband already, and his 2 children from a previous relationship. But he couldn't bring himself to leave the others behind, because he knew that they would die, because that's what was happening. They were just dying. And so he took 14 of his closest companions, people who'd been traveling with him all around Tasmania for the past, decade practically. And I think that he thought that they could somehow intermarry with the Boonwurrung people or the other people in Western Port or in Port Phillip. He didn't really know anything about the Aboriginal people of that area. And, he didn't understand that, these were completely alien people. They had no connection whatsoever, well, not for the last, 15,000 years, with the people from Victoria. And so they couldn't act as guides for him. They couldn't be intermediaries for him. And the government informed him that they were not going to pay. They were not going to feed them with rations. They weren't going to provide them with food. He would have to pay to look after them. Well, that was never part of his deal. His deal never was that he would be economically responsible for these people, and they were supposed to make money for him by giving him praise and land grants and stuff, because he'd been able to, I'm the protector of the Aborigines, I'm the person they trust, right? And so they were left to their own devices, and their devices were to go to Western Port, right down the end down towards Port Phillip, down towards Phillip Island, looking for a friend of theirs who disappeared, a man named Latrobe. And they had been told by a settler who they'd done some work for that Latrobe had been killed by a settler who lived down there. And so I think they were on a kind of reconnaissance to find out about this. And the problem was that their information was wrong, but they attempted to kill this man, whose name was Watson, and his son-in-law, when they kind of tried to ambush them and it didn't work. And then on another occasion, and then a posse was got up to chase them. This group included Truganini, by the way. And one day they saw them coming over the sand toward them and shot them, killed them. And it turned out it wasn't Watson and his son-in-law. It was 2 whalers who were kind of running away from a whaling station at Ladies Bay, and they'd killed the wrong people. And so then they had a posse chasing them, and they were up for murder and attempted murder. And eventually they were caught, and took months to catch them and put on trial. And the women, there were 3 women, Truganini was one of them, her partner, then Mulboy-Hina, and another man known as Tunawinawait, or Pive is the name I use for him, were hung for murder, and the women were allowed to, were forced to return to Flinders Island. But it's an extraordinary, and this is the first public hanging in Victoria, the first public hanging. It's an amazing story, really, because it's a story of completely misunderstanding about what, like, what were these Tasmanians doing in Victoria? Why on earth would you have thought you could take people from Tasmania and transplant them to Victoria and that everything in the garden would be rosy? So, it's another kind of, and of course, Robinson just walked away from it. He was overwhelmed with the responsibility of trying to deal with the murderous settlers, most of whom had come from Tasmania in Victoria, and what was happening to the clans around Port Phillip, who were basically being decimated by syphilis and disease and other diseases, and also just murderous settlers who wanted to get rid of them. And he just couldn't cope with having to deal with these people who were once his family, his black family. So that's another kind of, that's his ultimate betrayal, basically. And, it's really hard to forgive him for it. But again, there's that other side of the story, which is, well, what else was he going to do? Leave them on Flinders Island, where they would have all died.
You've been so brilliantly reviewed, and so many of the reviews, talk about the way you've really made these people come to life, and the way you're talking about them now, so animatedly, so passionately. We can see them as people, I guess, that could be, in the news now, that they're real people. I'm just wondering, as a historian, I guess it's part of your job just to document, history and show what happened. But as a writer, your focus is also really telling this human story. So I'm just wondering, as a person left in the aftermath of such a project, how you protect yourself from not letting, the pain and suffering and these atrocities that you're documenting kind of impact on you.
Protect myself.
You what, sorry?
I don't protect myself.
Right.
To a certain extent, I'm fighting against the ways in which the settler class and the generations that came after them had protected themselves from it by mythologizing it, by making it as if somehow or another these people just ceased to be. But at the same time, I spent many years working in slave narratives and slave stories in the United States, and I'm aware of the trap of a kind of trauma pornography, which is, you get too much into, people like to read about violence to black bodies, or see movies about it. It's a curious, odd thing. And I'm wishing to avoid that, so that whilst I feel the blows of the terrible things that were done, I don't write a lot about it, and I don't dwell on it partly because I am trying to avoid trauma pornography, but also because eventually, if you're really going to feel the true responsibility of being the inheritors of the land of the dispossessed, then you've got to see them as people just as rich and various and funny and clever as yourself. As indeed they were, probably a lot more clever, actually, in many respects, certainly in the way in which they could relate to the land, and they had very, very rich spiritual life, and they were fully complex human beings. And so it was much more important for me. In this respect, I'm different from most historians who write about what happened in colonial Australia. It's much more important for me to tell these wonderful stories of how they managed to live, particularly her. She lived a long life, and she managed to live a very good life under the circumstances, and managed to live a life that she was in control of, largely speaking, given that she was for all of her life from the age of 16 a prisoner of the colonial state, as they all were. And so I don't protect myself from the blows of it, which was probably apparent to you when I was talking about the man who was standing over her with his arms folded.
Yeah.
I feel the pain of it, but basically that's not going to do any good for anybody. And it's more important to think about the humanity of the people who we robbed blind and destroyed. We all grew up with well, maybe people of my generation anyway, with movies about the Indians. You couldn't make a movie like that now.
Yeah.
But certainly that sense of get away from the kind of savage, get away from the narrative of the savage, get away from the narrative of the poor, primitive, tragic figure, so primitive that they couldn't adjust, and look at these complex, interesting people who were basically destroyed by the colonial state.
From a writing perspective, though, and I would like to invite people who are listening, by the way, to engage with you with questions. So if they haven't already started putting questions in the chat, it'd be great for people to think of a question now and put it in the chat so we can come to them in a few minutes. But while you're talking about the idea of, how you're different from historians in that way, and you're really expert at making them come to life and for us to see as a reader the humanity, I'm just wondering if you can tell us about the writing process that makes you able to do that, because you're working with the same research that other people have worked with, yet you're somehow making these people seem so real and so human and so well-rounded as just people we can connect with.
Well, I think it is a question of your point of view. I think that the story of the genocide of the Tasmanian people is a story that's been often told. I told it myself to a certain extent in my first book. And so I don't think it's, that's not, so that's kind of broad brush stuff. I wanted to talk about my story, right, which is, what I said to begin with, which is the Nguinoni people of Bruny Island are the people whose land was bundled up and given to my ancestor and some other people too, including the famous James Kelly. But certainly my ancestor was the biggest inheritor of that land, the biggest grantee. And that, so therefore, although I may belong to one of the most downwardly mobile families in colonial history, because we lost it pretty quickly, the possibility was there to become rich, very rich, as many Tasmanian people who got big land grants did. But certainly it gave us the basis for a very good life in Tasmania. And so who were these people that we so callously got rid of? Who were they? And luckily, I had access to, well, we all have access to it, but I think I probably read George Augustus Robinson's journals more than anybody else on earth. The more I looked at it, the more I could see that you could turn his lens around and say, stop looking at these people through his eyes and just see what he was actually describing, and then try and write about that without the overlay of his paternalism, his Christianity, his sense of his being their savior, and just see them as these people in the landscape trying to make the best possible, negotiate's a very good word here, negotiate the best possible life for themselves. There's quite a few questions coming in.
Oh, that's okay. I just had one more thing. I think that's fascinating. You use the word perspective because I guess, and you've mentioned, that you were working with material that was freely available to other people. I think I've read you say before that it wasn't so much about excavating new sources, but combating conventional thinking. And in that way, I guess some people might sort of see the role of a historian today as almost a politicized thing, or they put that idea that a historian has become politicized because they're blowing our minds with this new history and they're trying to make us rethink what we've already known. What would you say to that? Because that's...
Well, basically, I would wonder what they thought they already knew.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, it's what you don't know. And although it's freely available to find it, it's, like, I don't deny for a minute when people say to me, I never knew this. I thought, well, they knew about it in the 19th century. They were pretty clear about.
Yeah, it's just that we had our blinkers on and we weren't.
It's easy enough to find. People were starting to write about what happened in the frontier wars in the 1920s. And so it did get politicized. It got politicized by John Howard. And I think the thing is that we have been terribly resistant in Australia to hearing stories about what we didn't know.
Yeah.
Like we've done very nicely here, thank you very much, without knowing this story. We don't want you people trying to tell us because it makes us feel bad. I was wanting to avoid that. I wanted to say, look, this is a terrific story. This is a terrific woman. She's a very significant person. Her name is recognized, although people don't necessarily know why they recognize the name. Let me tell you about her. She's terrific.
Yeah.
And I think that's basically, and it's a bit like the same with Bruce Pascoe, who sort of said, look, let me tell you about these people, these savages, Let me tell you about the complex world that they inhabited and how they lived, how they managed the landscape, how clever they were. And, that book has been a monumental bestseller. And my book is a bestseller. And so I can only think that there is a kind of real hunger for a different sort of narrative about the past, which doesn't deny the violence of it, the dispossession, the cruelty of it, but at the same time says, we need to value our Indigenous heritage. We need to value our Indigenous heritage. We need to value what was lost to us and try and recover as much of it as we can.
Thank you. Now, there have been all sorts of comments and questions popping up on the bottom of the screen. So I will go to Vicky Daddo from Latrobe Library. And Vicky, maybe you could start reading out a few of the questions that have come in.
Yeah. First one from Tom. What Indigenous people did you engage with, and is there a story in there?
That story. Yes. Well, I have had close relationships with the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre since I wrote my first book in 1990. And so I have done historical work for them to, help them in their quest to kind of recover their history and who they are. And so there was a sense that I had that I wasn't crossing over. I knew what my boundaries were. I did not want to have a situation where I was having to submit to, I don't work that way. I don't work collaboratively. very few writers do. It's just a difficult thing to do. But I did work quite closely with a major a member of one of the biggest Aboriginal families here, Gay Sculthorpe, who is now the curator of Oceania at the British Museum, because I was in London a lot to do research for this book. And and her sister, who's the director of the Aboriginal Centre here. And I was pretty confident that they would be encouraging of this project, although I knew that there were some other voices around who said, you don't have the right to tell this story. And my argument was, and I do have the right to tell this story because it's my story too. But this is fraught territory, this sense that we who are not First Nations people cannot presume that we have the right to tell First Nations story. We do have to kind of negotiate this relationship, and I did. It's worked out well. It's been well received by the Aboriginal community. But I have had criticism, there's no question about that, from people who, mostly non-Indigenous people actually, say, what right does she have to do this? Yeah. You just have to, go follow your heart, really.
I just saw a comment come up that mentioned the word birth. Vicky, what was that? Did you see that? I just read, today after a very lengthy birth. I was thinking, I've got to know the rest of that.
Okay, that's the last one that's come in. So today after a very lengthy birth, my friend Brenda McDermott supported her daughter in giving birth to Winnie. Brenda is a Palawa woman. Apologies if I misunderstood that. And I understand the intergenerational trauma and family violence that has impacted her family. So through the night we were aware of Truganini. And that's the end. I don't know if there's something else there, but
that's all right.
Just a comment.
I just wanted to touch on that one.
Yeah.
Are there other questions, Vicky, that you could
There
ask?
certainly are. Let me scroll back up. There's lots of questions just saying how much they've enjoyed your book. But Deb has asked, I'm wondering how long your research and writing process was, and how long did your project take from start to finish?
30 years.
Oh.
But actually, 30 years kind of gestation, I suppose. And once I decided to do it, it was material I was largely very familiar with. It probably took me 2 years. Yeah.
But like you said, it goes back to your first book, is it?
It does. And I've actually used material from my first book as well. It has been coming along for a long time. As I say, I would have done it before if I thought that it was appropriate. I would have done it earlier, but it never seemed to me that it was right for me to do it, because I thought that if somebody from the Palawa community should probably do it. And when it became apparent to me that they didn't want to, that they were so hostile in some ways to Truganini because she'd been thrown in there. I mean, I've heard elders from the community tell me about how she was thrown in their faces when they were children, about how they couldn't be Aboriginal because Truganini was the last, and the way in which she'd been used by the white community as a sort of icon of extinction meant that they became quite hostile to her. And I wanted to, again, I decided the project was to give the Aboriginal woman, Truganini, the First Nations woman, back to Australia, get rid of this notion of her in her Victorian dress. And
because what you're saying is just another layer of sadness that's happened to this woman, just another way that her own story has been
not a sad woman. She's not a tragic figure at all.
I mean the sadness that she was used in that way.
Oh, yes. The sadness for the people who come after her, that they had to have her flung in their faces all the time.
And it's made people be hostile to her, and that's like...
And I have had very significant people from the Palawa community tell me, with tears in their eyes, in fact, tears running down their face, in one person's case, male too, that I have given Truganini back to them, that they've been able to see her as their, as one of their old people, and not some person who's been a tool of oppression. And so that's the best possible response I could ever hope to have, really.
Absolutely. Vicky, are there other questions?
There are. Angela has asked, how has Bruce Pascoe's books and interpretations, and he's sold a lot of books, I'm told over 300,000, influenced a deep interest in our Aboriginal history and stories? And she's added just after, the truth telling is critical and forever ongoing.
Yes, absolutely so. I mean, it's astonishing, the response to Bruce's book. And as I said before, I think it's because it's a different narrative. It's not, let's tell you again about the massacres and the dispossession and the cruelty. And let's take that as a given. And now let's talk about, the richness of Aboriginal culture, the richness of an Aboriginal culture that persists into this day, the richness of that Australians need to embrace, even if it was a terrible, terrible situation. We need to be able to embrace a culture that is the oldest living culture, and also that was a rich and complex culture. We have to get rid of the narrative of savagery, which was the 19th century narrative. It was never true, never true. And so I think we've probably had enough of the stories of massacres and forced dispossessions and terrible, terrible prejudice and stolen children. And not that you deny those things or that you skirt over them, but rather let's have some other narratives as well.
Thank you. Vicky?
A more of a comment from Daryl. I wish we were taught the true history at school, so we could begin our questioning of the history of Australia. And further to Rose's comment earlier about the birth, she's added that Brenda is related to Truganini as a great, great, great aunt and has shared with Rose strength of Trugger. And then there's some other comments about wonderful talk and thank you about the informative talk.
I would say that the history that's being taught in schools now is very different. And it gives me a lot of hope that that Indigenous people, First Nations people, have a lot more engagement with the curriculum and what gets taught now. I mean, they had no engagement with the curriculum that I grew up with, but it's a very different landscape that my grandchildren are growing into intellectually, and what my grandchildren understand about Australia's Indigenous people. Yeah.
So has the role or the definition of a historian changed in that way, or is it just the way that we now choose to engage with history and accept that,
I think
it's always a complete
you've got to
story.
be able to talk to the general punters, and historians are not trained to do that. I mean, I think Henry Reynolds has done a very good job. He's the pathfinder, the pathbreaker here, in terms of writing books that moved outside of the academy and talked to a more general audience. But I remember when he was sneered at by academic historians for writing popular books.
Right.
It's never particularly bothered me because I wasn't attempting to build a career as an academic.
Yeah. Yeah, I read you say
that. I do think that historians have always, struggled to tell the truth about our past, but they've done it in a way that is pretty constrained by the very limiting way in which they have to write, and academic publishers who aren't interested in getting their books out to the general public, to be frank. They just want, a few copies in libraries and they're happy, and most people are happy because, that they need to have a respectable academic book that has been admired by the other 10 people who work in the same area.
Yeah, I've read you talk about that, and your disagreements with footnotes and
no footnotes,
no footnotes
in my book. No.
Yeah. Which of course brings your books to the general mainstream publishers and not limited to the niche academic publishers, and it makes your book win the biography award. It makes your book win the biography award, and it puts your book in the hands of more people that are finding out about this real history. So I guess that's a benefit. Yeah.
I do think that I don't think that history is changing. I do think that I've probably still got a pretty poor reputation in there amongst academic historians, but it doesn't fuss me too much.
Yeah.
No.
Well, are there other questions, Vicky? Because we're just
a couple of questions and comments. Helen says she especially likes Cassandra's comments that this work takes away another tool of oppression, which is a brilliant way of looking at it. Ariane has asked, what's the name of the book? Did I miss it? Is it A Community of Thieves?
No, that's your first book, but go, Cassandra.
Oh, that's my first book, where I first wrote about George Augustus Robinson and the dispossession of the Aboriginal people of Tasmania. A very early book because my family were involved in it, and so I've kind of circled back around to that same book. But from a but now, instead of looking through settler eyes, I'm now trying to look at it through with a different lens. I mean, I couldn't possibly try and look at it with First Nations eyes, but I am trying to give people their own agency as much as possible and not see them in some way as being dependent upon people like George Augustus Robinson, who was trying to save them or look after them, or in the case of my family, give them tea and sugar and be nice to them.
But to answer that question more directly, she was asking the name of the book because she'd missed it. So the book what we are talking about today.
Oh, it's Truganini.
Yes. Yeah. So,
Truganini. Yeah.
Definitely. And it's available in the library, and I'm sure you can find it at all good bookstores. And we are nearly up to time. Vicky, is there one more question?
Just that was the question. Where can we buy the book or borrow the book?
Okay.
Yes, you've answered that.
Now, Cassandra, I always do like to finish asking what you're working on next, but you said it's too complex to describe to me.
It's a companion piece to this one. It's the third book of a trilogy that begins with Community of Thieves, Truganini, and then last book is going to be called Mortal Possession, and it really has to do with what happens after Truganini is dead, and supposedly they're all dead, and so then you can start commodifying them and turn them into valuable museum pieces and sell them around the world. Yes.
Well, then the last thing I would like to ask you, because we have had a very engaged audience tonight, and I can tell they're an audience of readers, and I'm sure they'd love to hear maybe one or two recommendations from you about some other books that perhaps they might enjoy.
Well, the books that I've been most impressed with most recently, interestingly enough, both written by Tasmanian novelists. There's a fabulous book by my friend Amanda Laurie that won the Miles Franklin Award, little book, not too big a read, called The Labyrinth.
And that's fiction. That's a work of fiction.
Yeah. And then there's a really, really interesting kind of slightly dystopian, futuristic novel called The Rain Heron by a young Tasmanian writer called Robbie Arnott that won the Age Book of the Year. And then there's another book by a woman, I don't know anything about her, apart from the fact that she's an Irish-Australian writer named Charlotte McConaughey, and she's written this book, which I think in Australia is called The Last Migration. And it, again, is slightly futuristic, slightly dystopian, but as the years go by, the near future looks pretty dystopian, so it doesn't seem like it's science fiction or anything. About it's environmentally inflected by anxiety about what's happening to the world, but it's beautiful, lyrical, disturbingly wonderful book. I would like more people to read it. It's called The Last Migration.
Thank you for that. And I find it interesting that historian is pushing us towards dystopian books of the future. So there's a story in there somewhere too. Thank you so much for sharing such a great insight into your connection with this story and the importance of this story and why you wrote it. And so painstakingly, we can tell your passion and your commitment to, documenting this history and encouraging Australians to learn more about it. So thank you so much, Cassandra.
Well, thank you, Claire. I really I love the opportunity to talk to people about my book, actually. I mean, it's a lot of work, so you like to think that you're getting somewhere.
And thanks to everyone in the audience who's been so engaged. It's really added to it, having so many questions and comments. And thanks, of course, to the 4 libraries, the regional libraries who made this possible, and Vicky for wrangling all the back end stuff. Thank you, Vicky. Is there anything you wanted to say to finish up?
Just to wrap up, and thank you both for giving us a wonderful talk. There are many comments still coming in about how informative and engaging the talk has been, and we've had really fantastic feedback. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and you will get a copy of the video clip. And look out for more author talks coming up at your library soon.